US recession. What can the 2008 recession teach us about it? Layoffs, stock market crashes, and bailouts. America had experienced this before. Can we learn from the 2008 Great Recession, or are we doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past? The Great Recession was not caused by deus ex machina or bad luck shot. It was mainly due to bad choices Wall Street did. During the housing boom, bankers gave mortgage to people with credit and income difficulties. Many banks later sold these mortgages to other banks that merged debt with similar loans as investments called mortgage securities. The idea was that these packages earned the bank more money when the loans were paid. But when foreclosures increased, many banks began to fail. In order to fix the problem, the government passed reforms like the Dodd-Frank Wall Street reforms and Consumer Protection Act in 2010 and created the Troubled Asset Relief Program, a $700 billion program to let the government bail out failing banks. Back then, saving large banks and unsuccessful industries such as the automotive industry was very controversial. Many felt they were rewarding companies for making bad decisions. But ultimately, increased surveillance with government financial support has been linked to preventing the financial system from collapsing altogether. The Main Street was collapsed. The current stagnation is not caused by a broken connection within the system, but an external threat that is worldwide epidemic. To prevent the spread of the disease, many governments forced non-mandatory businesses to close and introduced lockout orders, and many industries caused a grinding halt. Fortunately, the overall financial system is much better this time, partly due to some policy changes made in response to the 2008 recession. Markets have already partially recovered, and the Dodd-Frank Act has helped make banks much healthier and able to withstand the market downturn, says Todd, an economist who researched the history of recessions at Cornell College. Policymakers have developed a script, while details of that script has changed over time. They have a much better idea of what to do during a crisis than they did during the Great Depression, or even in 2008, he says. Duke University economist Campbell Harvey proved more difficult to assist businesses. I don't even call it a bailout. A bailout to me means you're bailing out somebody that's done a bad job, whereas this is more like aid, he says. The scale and complexity of providing this help has been a challenge. Approximately 40% of the population in the United States of America is employed by more than 30 million small businesses. Whereas this recession, it's not really the financial institutions that are being hit, but millions of small and medium-sized businesses. Then the system broke down. Before 2008, the attitude that prevailed among economists and regulators was that markets would take care of themselves. It seemed to be working. Months before the economy started to shrink, the stock market had reached its all-time high, but the palace was built on a swamp. As foreclosures began to increase, banks that invested heavily in mortgage-backed securities, which were investments in other people's home mortgages, began to fail. People have lost their retirement savings, and companies have lost the investment they need to keep their business alive, completely unrelated to either banking or real estate. It took many by surprise. I think the reason why most economists didn't understand how bad this was is most economists couldn't wrap their mind around how stupid some of the players were being, Mr. Noob said. To address the issue, United States officials have announced a series of programs and policies aimed at bringing the country up, including passing the country through two separate incentive packages worth about $1 trillion between 2008 and 2009. The Federal Reserve lowered interest rates to zero and launched a quantitative easing program where the Fed bought investments to increase cash flow. Now the system has turned. It's still early days, but politicians have learned some lessons of 2008. Now we expect the government to take a very active role, Mr. Knoop says. The Fed's cut interest rate to zero in 2008 took more than 6 months from the collapse of Bear Stearns, one of the previous bank busts of the 85-year-old investment bank recession. This time, the Fed reduced interest rates to zero on days when President Trump's coronavirus declared a national emergency and spent $700 billion on a new quantitative expansion program. Just 2 weeks later, Congress passed a $2.2 trillion incentive package to help millions of Americans get out of work, and a second incentive might be on its way. But how we have gone through our daily lives, from using public transport to an office to work, have changed completely, and a new normal may be here to stay for a while. Some companies, such as Canadian technology giant Shopify, can get rid of offices completely, while others may consider automating certain jobs. This is really destroying people, and it's destroying human systems in the way we share ideas and technology and interacting with each other, Mr. Knoop says. Then it was like a slow-moving panic. One of the decisive aspects of the Great Recession was its length. The National Economic Research Bureau noted retrospectively that the economy first began to contract in December 2007. The Bear Stearns investment bank collapsed in February 2008, but by September the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped to 777.68 until 2020. Meanwhile, things started to slowly disappear. Until October 2010, the unemployment rate peaked at 10%. Recession is revealed by the uncertainty that the financial system can really get rid of, the uncertainty that someone's job is safe. If there is a lot of uncertainty, companies don't make capital investments and consumers don't spend, Mr. Harvey says. This uncertainty continued during the Great Recession. Even after the stock market recovered and production increased, employment was delayed and did not return to pre-recession lows until 2017. Now, like a hurricane, if the Great Recession was a long-term degenerative disease, the coronavirus economic decline is like a natural disaster that removes everything at once, says Harvey. You just can't pull out the playbook of 2008 and apply it to the 2020, he says. With the pandemic, there is no place to really hide. Everyone is affected around the world. Unemployment rate increased by 10 points between March and April to over 14%. GDP, the value of goods and services made in the United States, dropped about 5%. But there is a silver lining, Harvey says. The uncertainty of this stagnation is mostly biological. Initially, we did not know how fatal the disease was, what its side effects were, or what kind of treatments would be effective. But as time goes on, science progresses. The key thing for policymakers is to minimize the collateral damage, he says. This means ensuring that incentive packages are enough to keep good businesses on life support until they open their doors again. But some are skeptical that everything will start again. When the economy starts up, when social distancing comes to an end, when we have a vaccine, will employment go right back up to where it was the day before the pandemic hit? Asks Mr. Nope. Who knows? Maybe, but I think it's kind of unlikely. Most of the idea, comment, information, and criticism containing in these videos have been created by Daily News Report. Before making any important investment decision, use the information contained in these videos as a starting point for conducting your own research. If you make any investment or legal decision, it is advised to consult an expert before making this decision.